When grocery stores were a luxury and money was scarce, farm families had 30 tried-and-true dinners that could feed anyone who showed up at the table.
As far as these boys are concerned, well, hamburgers and hot dogs are
These weren't just meals. They were masterpieces of resourcefulness that turned simple ingredients into feasts that satisfied the hungriest field workers. These forgotten farmer dinners tell the story of American ingenuity in the kitchen.
And why not? They're looking forward to an important date, dinner at home with the family.
Each recipe represents generations of knowledge about making something extraordinary from what the land provided. Let's rediscover these incredible meals that built our country. The Threshing crew's ultimate feast. Picture 15 hungry men walking in from the fields at noon, dust on their clothes and sweat on their faces. They expected a meal that could fuel them through the afternoon of backbreaking work. Farm wives knew exactly what to serve. The Threshing crew's ultimate feast started with a massive pot roast, surrounded by every root vegetable from the cellar. This wasn't just dinner. This was a calculated strategy to feed the hardest working crew in the county without breaking the family budget. Carrots, potatoes, turnips, and onions all cooked together in one enormous roasting pan. The beauty was that this meal could stretch to feed anyone who showed up. An extra worker meant another scoop of vegetables, not panic in the kitchen. The secret was starting before dawn and letting everything slow cook while the morning chores got done. Sunday's golden promise. Sunday meant one thing on the farm. The best chicken in the yard was about to become dinner. Farm families didn't just fry chicken. They created a complete ritual around selecting, preparing, and serving their prized birds. The chosen hen met her fate Saturday evening, giving the meat time to rest before Sunday's grand preparation. The milk gravy, made in the same skillet, captured every bit of crispy goodness left behind. Those brown bits, stuck to the bottom of the cast-iron pan, held the secret to gravy that could make grown men weep with satisfaction. This wasn't convenience food. It was a weekly celebration that required planning, skill, and perfect timing. The lard had to reach exactly the right temperature. Too cool and the chicken absorbed grease. Too hot, and the outside burned before the inside cooked through. Children learned to pluck feathers while mothers heated the lard to that crucial temperature. Young hands worked alongside experienced ones, learning techniques that would feed their own families someday. The gravy technique alone separated good cooks from great ones, using fresh milk from the morning milking. The cream that had risen overnight made the gravy rich and golden, nothing like the thin store-bought substitutes that came later. Churn day's double reward. Making butter was exhausting work, but smart farm wives turned churn day into something special. The cream separator had done its job, leaving thick cream ready for the long process of churning into golden butter. While the cream turned to butter in that wooden churn, chicken simmered on the stove and fresh egg noodles rolled out on the kitchen table. 3 separate tasks happening at once, each requiring perfect timing to come together at dinner time. The real genius was serving it all over mashed potatoes, creating the ultimate comfort food combination. This wasn't just a meal, it was engineering designed to use every bit of dairy richness the farm could produce in one satisfying dinner. Fresh buttermilk from the churn, cream from the separator, and eggs from the henhouse all came together. The buttermilk that remained after churning became part of the noodle dough. The cream went into the mashed potatoes. Nothing got wasted on churn day. Rolling noodles by hand was an art that mothers taught daughters on churn days. The dough had to be rolled thin enough to cook quickly, but thick enough to hold up under the weight of chicken and gravy. When the pig became dinner, butchering day meant the entire farm community came together for one of the year's most important events. The blue enamel roaster came out for special occasions, and fresh pork with scalloped potatoes was the celebration meal that honored everyone's hard work. That distinctive blue roaster could hold enough food to feed a dozen hungry helpers who had spent hours processing the pig. Nothing could be wasted when a family invested months raising a pig for the table. Every scrap of meat found its purpose, and the choicest cuts went straight into the roaster with layers of thinly sliced potatoes from the root cellar. Layer after layer of sliced potatoes and fresh pork created a dish that could feed the neighbors who helped with butchering. The potatoes absorbed the rich pork drippings while the meat stayed tender and juicy, creating flavors that made the hard work worthwhile. The cream sauce binding everything together came from the farm's own dairy cows. That morning's milk provided the base for a sauce that turned simple ingredients into something worthy of the community feast. This meal represented months of planning, from raising the pig to growing the potatoes to timing the butchering perfectly. The Oat Bin Secret. When meat was scarce, farm wives discovered that oats could transform a small amount of ground beef into a feast. A pound of hamburger that might feed 3 people suddenly stretched to satisfy 8 hungry mouths when mixed with ground oats from the feed bin. This wasn't just meatloaf. It was engineering designed to feed a large family with whatever protein they could afford. The oats absorbed moisture and expanded, creating bulk that made expensive meat go twice as far without anyone feeling cheated. The ketchup glaze on top made it look like a special occasion meal, even when money was tight. That shiny red coating transformed humble ingredients into something that looked like it belonged on a restaurant table. The sweet, tangy flavor masked any hint that this was stretcher food. Ground oats from the feed bin stretched the meat while adding nutrition and substance. Farm wives ran whole oats through their hand-crank grinders, creating a coarse meal that bound with the beef like magic. The oats added fiber and vitamins that store-bought breadcrumbs couldn't provide. Farm families ate this during lean times, but remembered it fondly, because it never felt like deprivation. Children asked for seconds and thirds, never suspecting they were eating Depression-era survival food. The secret was mixing the oats with milk and eggs to create a texture that fooled everyone. The milk softened the oats, while the eggs bound everything into a loaf that sliced clean and held together perfectly. Pounding out tough times. Round steak was cheap because it was tough, but farm wives knew exactly how to transform it into something tender. The butcher sold this cut for half the price of better steaks because most people couldn't figure out how to make it edible. The meat mallet came out first, pounding the steak until it submitted to their will. Those wooden mallets with the textured heads broke down the tough fibers that made round steak chewy. Farm wives pounded with rhythm and purpose, flattening the meat until it doubled in size. Flour, tomatoes, and onions created a gravy that could make shoe leather taste good. The flour coating caught the drippings during browning, creating the base for a sauce that would simmer for hours. Canned tomatoes from the previous summer's harvest added acidity that helped break down stubborn meat fibers. This technique turned the cheapest cut of beef into a meal that satisfied the hungriest farm workers. What started as tough, stringy meat became fork-tender perfection that fell apart at the touch of a knife. Swiss steak required patience, slow cooking for hours, while other chores got done around the farm. The low heat and long cooking time transformed tough connective tissue into rich, silky texture. The tomato-onion gravy was the real star, rich enough to make everyone forget they were eating budget meat. That sauce captured all the concentrated flavors from browning and slow cooking, creating something that tasted expensive. Farm wives took pride in their ability to make tough cuts, tender through skill and determination. This dish proved that technique mattered more than expensive ingredients when feeding a family. The Hayfield Hero. When hay season arrived, farm wives needed meals that could simmer unattended while everyone worked the fields. The timing was always unpredictable. Weather could change in an hour, and crews might work until sunset or come in early when equipment broke down. The Nesco roaster became the hero of harvest time, slow-cooking goulash that would be ready whenever the crew came in. That electric roaster sat on the kitchen counter like a faithful servant, maintaining perfect temperature without any supervision from the cook. Ground beef, noodles, and vegetables all cooked together in one pot that could feed a dozen people. onions, tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were ready in the garden joined the beef and egg noodles in that reliable roaster. The result fed hungry workers without requiring constant attention from farm wives who had their own field work to manage. This wasn't fancy cooking, it was strategic meal planning for the busiest time of year. Every ingredient had to earn its place by being hearty, filling, and capable of long cooking without turning to mush. The best part was that it actually improved the longer it cooked, perfect for unpredictable farm schedules. The flavors melded together over hours of gentle heat, creating something richer than any quick meal could achieve. Farm wives could start it at dawn, and no dinner would be perfect, whether the crew returned at noon or sunset. August's garden treasure. Late summer meant cabbage heads the size of basketballs growing in the garden and rows of glass jars filled with tomato sauce from the previous year's canning. August was the perfect time to combine this year's fresh cabbage harvest with last summer's preserved tomatoes. Rolling cabbage leaves around seasoned rice and meat created individual packages of comfort that could feed the whole family. Each leaf had to be blanched in boiling water until it was pliable, but not mushy, then carefully wrapped around a mixture of ground meat, rice, and onions. The tomato sauce came from jars preserved the summer before, connecting this year's harvest to last year's abundance. Opening those jars released the concentrated flavor of summer tomatoes that had been captured at their peak and stored in the cellar through winter and spring. This dish required patience and skill. Each roll had to be perfect, each leaf blanched just right. Too long in the boiling water and the leaves fell apart. Too short, and they cracked when rolled. Farm wives developed the timing through years of practice. Farm wives made dozens at once, knowing that cabbage rolls improved with time and reheating. The flavors melded together overnight, making day-old cabbage rolls even more satisfying than fresh ones. Children learned to help with the rolling, turning meal preparation into family tradition. Small hands were perfect for spreading the filling and rolling the leaves tight enough to hold together during cooking. August cabbage rolls celebrated both the current harvest and the foresight of previous seasons, proving that good planning created year-round abundance from simple ingredients. The old hen's final glory. When laying hens stopped producing eggs, they got one last chance to feed the family with dignity. These old birds had served faithfully for years, providing breakfast eggs and baby chicks. Now their tough meat would become the foundation for one of the most satisfying meals on the farm. The pressure cooker transformed tough old birds into tender meat that fell off the bone. That whistling pot worked magic that regular boiling could never achieve. The steam pressure broke down the stubborn connective tissue that made old hens chewy, turning them into silky, flavorful meat. Drop dumplings made from simple flour and water stretched the meal to feed everyone at the table. Farm wives mixed basic flour with just enough water to form a thick batter, then dropped spoonfuls directly into the bubbling broth. Breakfast's evening victory. Sometimes the best dinner was actually breakfast served when the sun went down. Farm families discovered this truth during the busiest seasons when traditional cooking took too much time and energy after 16-hour workdays. Biscuits and sausage gravy represented comfort food at its most fundamental level. The combination delivered everything a tired body needed: carbohydrates for energy, protein for strength, and fat for satisfaction. No fancy ingredients required, just flour, milk, and meat from the farm's own production. Farm families discovered that breakfast foods could satisfy dinner hunger just as well as traditional meals. The beauty was in the simplicity. Hot biscuits split open and smothered in rich, peppery gravy that stuck to hungry ribs better than most elaborate dinners. The key was making everything from scratch. Biscuits that were fluffy, gravy that was rich and peppery. Farm wives used fresh milk from the evening milking and sausage they had made and smoked themselves. Every element connected directly to the land that supported the family. This meal cost almost nothing but delivered maximum satisfaction after long days of physical work. New Year's Lucky Feast. January 1st meant pork and sauerkraut, a tradition that promised prosperity for the coming year. Farm families woke up on New Year's Day knowing exactly what would grace their dinner table that evening. The crock of kraut had been fermenting since autumn, developing the perfect tangy bite through months of patient waiting. That wooden crock sat in the cool cellar, transforming fresh cabbage into something sharp and complex that could cut through the richness of winter pork. Buttered potatoes provided the mild backdrop that let the bold flavors of pork and kraut shine. Those simple boiled potatoes, mashed with fresh butter from the churn, created the perfect neutral canvas for the intense combination of salty pork and sour cabbage. This wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual that connected farm families to their German and Eastern European roots. Immigrant families brought this tradition across the ocean, believing that eating pork on New Year's Day would bring wealth because pigs root forward, never backward. The combination was supposed to bring good luck, but it definitely brought satisfaction on cold winter days. The rich pork fat warmed bellies, while the tangy kraut provided vitamins that fresh vegetables couldn't supply in the middle of winter. Farm wives planned this meal months in advance, timing the kraut fermentation perfectly. Making kraut in late summer meant it would be ready for New Year's dinner after months of slow transformation in the cellar. Every family had their own variation, but the core combination never changed: pork, kraut, and potatoes. New Year's dinner represented hope, tradition, and the promise that preserved foods would carry families through winter. Church basement classic. Some meals were so popular they appeared at every church supper and community gathering. Beef and wide noodles over mashed potatoes became the gold standard that every church basement cook knew by heart. This combination satisfied everyone from small children to the hardest-working farmers in the congregation. The wide egg noodles provided substance that thin pasta couldn't match, while tender beef gave protein that kept field workers going through long afternoons. Church basement cooks knew that simple, hearty food brought communities together better than fancy dishes. They understood that comfort food had to work for everyone, from toddlers in high chairs to elderly members who needed easy-to-chew meals. The secret was using plenty of butter and cream to make everything rich and satisfying. Fresh butter melted into the mashed potatoes, while cream bound the beef and noodles into something that felt like a warm hug on a plate. Storm night salvation. When bad weather trapped families indoors, pantry ingredients had to create satisfying meals that could lift spirits and fill stomachs. Storm nights meant no trips to town and no fresh ingredients from the garden. Whatever sat on the shelf had to become dinner. Canned tuna, frozen peas, and white bread became the foundation for emergency comfort food that actually tasted good. That tin of tuna transformed from simple fish into the protein base for something that felt substantial and warming during cold, stormy nights. Farm families learned to make this combination taste like a treat rather than emergency rations. The key was seasoning the cream sauce well with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were available. Toasting the bread until it could support the weight prevented soggy disappointment. Stormy weather meals proved that comfort could come from the simplest combinations when prepared with care and attention. Field Thermos magic. Taking hot meals to workers in distant fields required containers that could keep food warm for hours. The old thermos jug became the lifeline between the farm kitchen and crews working acres away from the house, maintaining serving temperature through morning and afternoon shifts. Sloppy Joes, made from home-canned tomato sauce, traveled better than almost any other hot meal. The thick sauce clung to the ground beef without separating during transport, and the mixture actually improved after sitting in the thermos for hours as flavors melded together. The sauce was made during tomato season and stored in jars for year-round convenience. Farm wives processed bushels of ripe tomatoes in late summer, creating dozens of quart jars filled with rich, seasoned sauce that would become countless field meals throughout the year. Rainy day perfection. When weather stopped outdoor work, farm wives used the time to create meals that required extra attention. Rain drumming on the roof meant a chance to tackle the kind of cooking that busy seasons never allowed, the careful, time-intensive dishes that made a house feel like home. Chicken pot pie with homemade lard crust was the ultimate rainy day project. This wasn't a quick dinner thrown together between chores. This was an all-day labor of love that transformed simple ingredients into something that could feed a family for days. Every ingredient came from the farm: chicken from the yard, vegetables from the garden, cream from the dairy. The filling combined whatever vegetables were available with tender chicken meat and rich cream sauce, creating a complete meal wrapped in golden pastry. Rainy day cooking allowed time for the careful techniques that busy seasons didn't permit. Rolling out pie crust and assembling the filling became a meditative break from the usual farm rush. Each step required patience and attention that field work rarely allowed. Sweet cream skillet gold. Fresh corn from the garden met sweet cream from the separator in a cast-iron skillet that made magic happen. August mornings meant walking through rows of corn taller than a man's head, selecting ears with kernels so tender they popped when you pressed them with your fingernail. Salt pork cracklings added the smoky, salty crunch that made this simple side dish unforgettable. Those golden bits of rendered pork fat brought texture and flavor that transformed sweet corn into something that belonged on Sunday dinner tables. The cast iron held heat perfectly, caramelizing the corn while the cream created a luxurious sauce. That seasoned skillet distributed temperature evenly, browning corn kernels without burning while the cream reduced into something golden and rich. Salt pork cracklings were the leftover treasure from rendering lard, too good to waste. After making lard for pie crusts and frying, those crispy bits waited in glass jars, ready to transform ordinary vegetables into something extraordinary. Calving season comfort. When spring calving season arrived, farm families needed meals that could simmer unattended during long nights in the barn. Pregnant cows required constant watching, and someone had to check on them every few hours through the night. There was no time for complicated cooking when new calves might arrive at any moment. Chili became the perfect solution, hearty, warming, and better after hours of slow cooking. The longer it simmered on the back of the stove, the richer the flavors became. Farm wives could throw together ground beef, beans, and tomatoes in the morning, and no dinner would be waiting whenever the family could gather around the table. Cast-iron cornbread baked in the same reliable pan every time, creating crispy edges and tender centers. That seasoned skillet had been making cornbread for years, developing the perfect non-stick surface that modern pans couldn't match. The hot iron created a golden crust while keeping the inside moist and crumbly. Ham steak morning glory. Ham steak with red-eye gravy represented Southern farm cooking at its most distinctive. This wasn't found on tables up north or out west. It was pure Southern tradition that marked a family's regional roots as clearly as their accent. Sliced apples cooked in butter until they were tender and golden, their natural sweetness cutting through the rich saltiness of ham and the bitter edge of coffee gravy. This meal could appear at breakfast, dinner, or supper because it satisfied at any hour. Red-eye gravy required strong coffee and the skill to balance those intense flavors without letting one overpower the others. Too much coffee, and the gravy turned bitter. Too little, and it lacked the distinctive punch that made it memorable. And the skill to balance those intense flavors without letting one overpower the others. Too much coffee, and the gravy turned bitter. Too little, and it lacked the distinctive punch that made it memorable. Farm-cured ham provided the intense flavor that made this simple meal unforgettable. Hams that had been salt-cured and smoke-aged for months delivered concentrated taste that store-bought meat couldn't match. Fried apples used fruit that might be past fresh eating, but perfect for cooking. Slightly soft apples that wouldn't keep much longer found new purpose in the skillet. Ham steak dinners represented regional traditions that connected farm families to their cultural roots. Haying day strategy. Hay season demanded meals that could cook themselves while everyone worked in the fields. When weather was perfect for cutting and baling, every hand was needed from dawn to dusk. There was no time for complicated cooking that required constant attention. Kielbasa and cabbage in a vinegar skillet required minimal attention, but delivered maximum satisfaction. The smoky Polish sausage provided protein that could sustain hard-working crews, while the cabbage stretched the meal to feed everyone who showed up at the table. The vinegar brightened the rich sausage and tender cabbage, creating a perfect balance of flavors. That splash of vinegar cut through the fat from the kielbasa and added the tangy bite that made this simple combination memorable. The acid also helped break down the cabbage fibers, making everything tender. This meal used ingredients that could withstand long cooking without losing their appeal. Kielbasa was already fully cooked, so it couldn't be ruined by extra time in the skillet. Cabbage actually improved with slow cooking, becoming sweet and silky. First picking paradise. The first new potatoes and peas of the season deserved a preparation that honored their delicate perfection. Farm wives watched their gardens carefully in late spring, waiting for those marble-sized potatoes and tender pea pods that signaled winter was finally over. Creamed new potatoes and peas represented the reward for months of waiting through winter and spring. After eating stored root vegetables and canned goods for months, these first fresh vegetables tasted like pure sunshine on a plate. These vegetables were so tender and sweet, they needed only cream and butter to become extraordinary. The natural sugars in baby peas and new potatoes were at their peak, requiring no fancy seasonings or complicated preparations to shine. First picking meals celebrated the return of fresh food after a winter of preserved and stored ingredients. Opening the root cellar had sustained the family through cold months, but nothing matched the taste of vegetables pulled from warm spring soil. New potatoes had skins so tender they didn't need peeling, just gentle scrubbing under cool water. Those paper-thin skins held all the flavor and nutrients, making peeling a waste of both time and taste. Fresh peas were sweet enough to eat raw, but even better when barely cooked in rich cream. The key was cooking them just long enough to warm through, while keeping their bright green color and crisp texture. This dish marked the turning point from winter scarcity to summer abundance. First picking celebrations reminded farm families why they endured the hard work of gardening through another season. Iron tonic tradition. Liver and onions wasn't just dinner, it was medicine disguised as a meal. Farm wives served this combination, knowing it would build strength in growing children and cure the fatigue that came from long days of physical work. Farm families understood that iron-rich liver could cure weakness and pale complexions better than any store-bought tonic. Children who complained of being tired got liver for dinner until their energy returned. Working men who felt run down found themselves facing plates of liver until their strength came back. Sweet cream gravy made the strong-flavored liver palatable even for reluctant eaters. That rich, smooth sauce covered the intense mineral taste that made children wrinkle their noses. The gravy transformed medicine into comfort food that even picky eaters would finish. This meal appeared regularly on farm tables because hard work demanded strong bodies and steady energy. Farm wives scheduled liver dinners based on the family's needs, more often during harvest season when everyone worked from dawn to dusk. The key was not overcooking the liver, keeping it tender rather than tough and bitter. Overcooked liver became like shoe leather and tasted twice as bad. Perfect timing meant liver that was cooked through but still tender enough to cut with a fork. Onions provided the sweet contrast that balanced liver's intense mineral flavor. Those caramelized onions added natural sweetness that softened the strong taste without masking the nutrition the family needed. Farm wives knew that good nutrition sometimes required making medicine taste like comfort food. Iron tonic dinners represented the practical approach farm families took to maintaining health through food. Winter jar treasure, glass jars of home-canned beef tips, represented security during long winter months. Farm wives spent summer days processing tender cuts of beef into sealed jars that would feed the family when snow covered the ground and fresh meat was scarce. The canning process began with selecting the finest cuts from freshly butchered beef, typically the chuck or round that would become tender through pressure canning. Each piece was cut to uniform size, ensuring even cooking and perfect presentation when the jar was opened months later. The meat was packed carefully into sterilized quart jars, leaving precisely 1 inch of headspace to allow for proper sealing. Raw packing was the preferred method for beef tips, as it preserved more natural juices than hot packing. Salt was added to each jar, 1 teaspoon per quart, not for flavor, but to help draw out moisture during processing. The filled jars went into the pressure canner for 90 minutes at 10 pounds pressure, a process that guaranteed both safety and tenderness. The tender meat needed only reheating and serving over buttered bread to create a satisfying meal. Those beef tips had been cooked once during the canning process, making them fork tender and ready to eat with minimal preparation. Winter jar meals proved that summer's preservation work paid dividends when fresh food was hard to come by. Beef tips canned at home were more tender and flavorful than anything available in stores. The home canning process broke down tough fibers while sealing in all the rich, meaty flavors. Each jar held chunks of beef that had been carefully selected and processed at the peak of quality. Opening a jar of home-canned beef tips released aromas that filled the winter kitchen with the promise of summer abundance. The meat emerged fork tender, surrounded by its own rich juices that had concentrated during the canning process. Steam rising from the heated contents created instant comfort on the coldest days. Timber edge bounty. When hunting season provided venison, farm families knew exactly how to transform wild game into civilized dinners. The successful hunter who brought home a deer faced the challenge of turning strong-flavored wild meat into something the whole family would eat without complaint. Proper field dressing and aging made the difference between good venison and meat that tasted too wild for family consumption. The deer had to be field dressed immediately, cooled quickly, and aged in the cold barn for at least a week. This aging process allowed natural enzymes to break down tough fibers while developing more complex flavors. Venison roast with onion gravy required techniques that tamed the strong flavors of wild meat. Farm wives soaked the roast in milk overnight to draw out the blood and gamey taste. Then they rubbed it with salt and herbs before slow roasting it with plenty of onions that would become the base for rich gravy. The milk soaking process was crucial for family acceptance of wild game. Fresh milk, changed twice during the soaking period, drew out the blood that created metallic flavors. The roast emerged from its milk bath, looking paler and milder, ready for seasoning that would complement rather than mask its natural flavors. Slow roasting at low temperature prevented the meat from becoming tough and stringy. The roast went into a 270 195-degree oven surrounded by sliced onions that would caramelize during the long cooking process. This gentle heat broke down tough fibers without drying out the lean wild meat. Saturday's boiler feast. Saturday meant using the big boiler to create meals that could feed everyone with minimal effort. Farm wives brought out that large pot, knowing they could transform scraps and leftovers into something that would satisfy the hungriest workers without requiring constant attention. Ham bones, cabbage, and rutabagas simmered together into a complete dinner that cost almost nothing. Those bones from Sunday's ham still held plenty of meat and flavor, while cabbage from the garden and rutabagas from the root cellar added substance and nutrition. It was the family's largest vessel, often holding 4 to 6 gallons, seasoned black from years of use over wood-fired stoves. This was serious equipment for serious cooking, the kind of pot that could feed a threshing crew or provide meals for multiple days without breaking a sweat. Timing was everything with boiler meals. Smart farm wives started the pot bubbling right after breakfast cleanup, knowing that 8 hours of gentle simmering would transform tough ingredients into fork-tender perfection. The ham bones went in first, alone, to create a rich base broth that would become the foundation for everything that followed. The boiler method extracted every bit of flavor and nutrition from ingredients that might otherwise be wasted. That slow, gentle cooking pulled the last traces of meat from the bones while creating a rich broth that made everything taste expensive. Steam would rise from that pot all day, filling the kitchen with aromas that promised satisfaction. Saturday boiler dinners used leftovers and scraps to create meals that satisfied better than costly ingredients. Ham bones from previous meals still had enough meat clinging to them to create rich, satisfying broth that formed the foundation of the entire meal. Those bones often came from 3 or 4 different Sunday dinners, accumulated in the cold cellar until enough gathered to justify firing up the big boiler. Root cellars provided the winter vegetables that turned bone broth into complete meals. Cabbage heads wrapped in newspaper stayed crisp through winter months, while rutabagas buried in sawdust remained sweet and firm until spring. These storage vegetables had been selected in fall specifically for their keeping qualities and their ability to improve with slow cooking. Rutabagas were the forgotten root vegetable that added sweetness and substance to winter meals. These purple-topped roots had been stored in the cellar since fall, developing natural sugars that balanced the salty ham and mild cabbage perfectly. Unlike turnips, which could turn bitter, rutabagas grew sweeter during storage, their starches converting to sugars that created natural sweetness without added cost. The layered cooking process required understanding each ingredient's timing. Rutabagas needed hours to become tender, so they joined the bones early in the process. Cabbage went in during the final 2 hours, long enough to become silky, but not so long that it disappeared into mush. Seasonings came last. Farm wives tasted and adjusted until the broth sang with perfect balance. This cooking method required patience, but rewarded families with deeply flavored, nutritious food. The long, slow simmer allowed all the flavors to blend together while the tough rutabagas became tender and the cabbage melted into silky sweetness. Saturday boiler meals proved that the best dinners often came from the humblest ingredients and the willingness to let time work its magic. Leftover pan magic. Leftover cornmeal mush became the foundation for a completely different meal the next day. Farm wives never threw away the thick, golden mush that remained after breakfast. Instead, they poured it into a loaf pan and let it cool overnight in the cellar until it became firm enough to slice. Transformation began with perfect cornmeal mush preparation the day before. This wasn't thin, watery porridge, but thick, substantial mush that could support a spoon standing upright. The cornmeal had to be stirred constantly during cooking to prevent lumps, creating a smooth, golden mass that would hold its shape when cooled. Slicing cold mush and frying it until crispy transformed humble leftovers into something special. Those thick slices hit the hot cast iron skillet with a satisfying sizzle, developing golden crusts that crackled when you bit into them. The outside turned crispy, while the inside stayed creamy and smooth. The slicing technique mattered as much as the cooking. Slices cut too thin would fall apart in the pan, while thick slices wouldn't develop proper crusts. The perfect slice measured about 3/4 of an inch thick, substantial enough to hold together, but thin enough to cook evenly. Sharp knives were essential. Ragged cuts created uneven surfaces that wouldn't brown properly. Cast iron skillets, preheated until water droplets danced across the surface, provided the intense heat needed for proper crusting. A thin layer of bacon grease or lard prevented sticking while adding flavor that complemented the corn's natural sweetness. The first side needed to develop a deep golden crust before flipping. Impatience resulted in torn, uneven surfaces. Sausage syrup made from drippings and a touch of sweetener created the perfect topping. Farm wives saved the fat and brown bits from breakfast sausage, then mixed them with a little molasses or honey. The result was a sweet, savory sauce that made fried mush taste like dessert. Creating sausage syrup required understanding the balance between sweet and savory elements. Too much sweetener made it cloying, while too little left it just greasy. Brown bits from the sausage, those caramelized proteins and fats, provided the complex flavors that elevated simple drippings into something worth saving. This technique proved that farm families never truly had leftovers, just ingredients for tomorrow's meal. What looked like waste became the star of the next day's breakfast or supper, depending on when hunger struck. The timing flexibility made fried mush perfect for unpredictable farm schedules. Fried mush slices had crispy outsides and creamy centers that satisfied both texture and flavor cravings. Every bite delivered contrasts that made simple cornmeal feel exciting. Sausage syrup balanced sweet and savory flavors in a way that made breakfast feel like dessert. Leftover transformation was an art form that farm wives mastered out of necessity and perfected through practice. They understood that creativity could turn yesterday's breakfast into today's treat. Leftover pan meals represented the ultimate victory of creativity over waste. End-of-season salvation. When the garden season ended, smart farm wives saved every scrap in the freezer for one final feast. Those plastic bags accumulated throughout the harvest months, a handful of green beans here, some corn kernels there, carrot tops that were too good to throw away. The collection process started in midsummer when the first vegetables reached maturity. Every time a farm wife prepared vegetables for canning or fresh eating, the scraps went into labeled freezer bags. Beet greens too tender for the compost, corn kernels cut from imperfect cobs, green beans with slight blemishes that wouldn't look perfect in canning jars. Everything edible found its way into those accumulating bags. Organization became crucial as the bags multiplied. Smart cooks labeled each bag with contents and dates, understanding that some vegetables would contribute better flavors than others. Root vegetable peelings provided earthy depth, while herb trimmings added complexity that elevated simple vegetable scraps into sophisticated soup bases. Kettle soup made from freezer bag ends transformed vegetable scraps into a satisfying meal that could feed the whole family. Farm wives emptied every bag into their biggest pot, creating combinations that changed with each batch, depending on what the season had provided. This wasn't garbage soup. It was the concentrated essence of an entire growing season. Every spoonful contained the memory of July tomatoes, August corn, September beans, and October carrots. Flavors told the story of months spent tending, harvesting, and preserving. The cooking process required intuition developed over years of similar soup making. Heartier vegetables like carrot chunks and potato pieces went in first, needing longer cooking times to become tender. Leafy greens and herb trimmings waited until the final minutes, preserving their bright flavors and preventing them from disappearing into mush. Seasoning end-of-season soup challenged even experienced cooks because every batch contained different combinations of vegetables. The soup might be predominantly corn-flavored one year, heavy with tomato the next. Every spoonful contained the memory of July tomatoes, August corn, September beans, and October carrots. The flavors told the story of months spent tending, harvesting, and preserving. The cooking process required intuition developed over years of similar soup making. Heartier vegetables like carrot chunks and potato pieces went in first, needing longer cooking times to become tender. Leafy greens and herb trimmings waited until the final minutes, preserving their bright flavors and preventing them from disappearing into mush. Seasoning end-of-season soup challenged even experienced cooks because every batch contained different combinations of vegetables. The soup might be predominantly corn-flavored one year, heavy with tomato the next. Each batch required tasting and adjusting, building flavor layers that would complement whatever vegetables dominated that particular harvest. Every vegetable that was too small to preserve individually found its purpose in the season-end kettle. Those few green beans that didn't fill a canning jar, the corn kernels cut from cobs with blemishes, the beet greens that were too tender to waste. Everything had value in this final celebration. The variety of vegetables created complex flavors that couldn't be achieved with any single ingredient. Each pot was different because each garden produced its own unique combination of abundance and oddments. This unpredictability became part of the soup's charm. No two batches would ever taste exactly the same. Farm families looked forward to this soup because it tasted like the memory of summer abundance concentrated into one warming bowl. Nothing edible was ever wasted when creative cooks could transform scraps into satisfying meals. End-of-season soup represented the perfect closure to months of gardening and preserving work. Barn shift sustenance. Late-night barn shifts during calving season required food that could be eaten quickly and quietly. When cows were ready to deliver, someone had to check on them every few hours through the night. These midnight meals had to fuel exhausted farmers without waking the whole household. Calving season stretched from February through April, when temperatures could drop below zero and winds cut through multiple layers of clothing. The physical demands of checking pregnant cows, assisting difficult births, and caring for newborn calves in harsh conditions required fuel that would sustain energy through long, cold hours of outdoor work. SOS on baking powder biscuits provided the protein and carbohydrates needed for long, cold nights. That creamed chipped beef on hot biscuits delivered everything a tired body needed: salt, fat, protein, and filling starches that would sustain energy through hours of barn work. The military heritage of SOS, dried beef on toast, known by soldiers as same old stuff, or more colorful variations, made it perfect for farm emergency feeding. Originally designed to provide maximum nutrition with shelf-stable ingredients, it adapted perfectly to farm life where midnight hunger struck without warning and convenience foods didn't exist. Preparation had to be fast enough for someone operating on 2 hours of sleep, but substantial enough to fuel hard physical labor. The cream sauce started with bacon grease or butter. Flour whisked in to create a roux, then milk added gradually to prevent lumps. Dried beef, torn into bite-sized pieces, went in just long enough to heat through without becoming tough. Baking powder biscuits were faster than yeast bread, but still provided the foundation for a substantial meal. Mixed, rolled, and baked in under 30 minutes, these biscuits emerged from the oven light, fluffy, and capable of soaking up every drop of the creamy sauce without falling apart. Garden pickles on the side added the bright acidity that cut through rich, creamy flavors. Those tangy cucumber slices preserved in vinegar provided the sharp contrast that made heavy comfort food feel balanced and complete instead of overwhelming. The pickle choice mattered. Sweet pickles would fight with the savory cream sauce. Barn-shift meals had to be portable, satisfying, and able to provide sustained energy. The combination could be eaten with one hand while holding a lantern with the other. No fancy plates or utensils required, just substantial food that could be consumed standing up in the kitchen before heading back outside. The portability factor couldn't be ignored. Sometimes calving emergencies required eating while walking to the barn or wolfing down food between checking different groups of cattle. Everything had to stay together without making a mess or requiring two hands to manage. SOS was military-inspired comfort food that farm families adapted for their own demanding schedules. The creamed beef mixture traveled well and reheated easily, making it perfect for unpredictable barn duty timing. Baking powder biscuits were faster than yeast bread but still provided the foundation for a substantial meal. Homemade pickles preserved the garden's brightness for times when fresh vegetables were unavailable. Barn-shift dinners proved that even the most challenging work schedules could include satisfying, nourishing food that honored both necessity and taste. Puller's picnic perfection. When neighbors gathered to pull stumps or raise barns, the meal had to be special enough to thank volunteers for their backbreaking labor. Farm families understood that community cooperation required proper hospitality. You couldn't ask for help without offering something worthy in return. Cold roast beef with horseradish cream represented the finest hospitality that honored hard-working helpers. This combination showed neighbors they were valued members of the community whose time and sweat deserved recognition. The cold presentation made it practical for outdoor serving while maintaining an air of elegance. This wasn't everyday food. It was the best the farm could offer to show appreciation for community cooperation. Farm wives saved their finest cuts of beef for these occasions, knowing that reputation in farming communities traveled fast. Cheap food meant cheap gratitude. Cold roast beef required advanced planning and the best cut the family could afford. The meat had to be cooked perfectly the day before, then chilled overnight to achieve the right texture for slicing. No shortcuts could be taken when the community was watching. Horseradish cream provided the sharp bite that elevated simple roast beef into something memorable. Fresh horseradish root was grated and mixed with cream to create a sauce that cleared sinuses and made simple beef taste sophisticated. That fiery kick separated this meal from ordinary fare. The preparation ritual began before dawn on workdays. Farm wives would rise early to slice the chilled beef paper thin, arrange it on their best platters, and prepare fresh batches of horseradish cream. Every slice had to be perfect because imperfect food reflected poorly on the entire family's reputation. Puller's picnic meals had to be impressive enough to ensure neighbors would return when help was needed again. The combination was elegant enough for company, but practical enough to serve outdoors. Community work meals represented the social bonds that held farming communities together. Friday night tradition. Friday night meant fish, and salmon patties were the affordable way to honor that tradition. Farm families who couldn't afford fresh fish found a solution in those tall cans of pink salmon that sat on pantry shelves year-round. Canned salmon became crispy, golden patties that satisfied fish cravings without breaking the budget. Farm wives mixed the flaked salmon with breadcrumbs and eggs, then shaped them into patties that sizzled in hot cast-iron skillets. The outside developed a golden crust, while the inside stayed moist and flaky. The art of salmon patties lay in the proportions. Too much filler made them taste like breadcrumbs. Too little made them fall apart in the pan. Experienced cooks knew to drain the salmon thoroughly, removing every bit of liquid that could make the mixture too wet. The best patties held together without being dense, crispy without being dry. Creamed peas provided the rich, comforting side that made this simple meal feel complete. Those bright green peas, whether fresh from the garden or frozen from the previous season, simmered in cream sauce that balanced the salty salmon perfectly. The cream sauce was never thick enough to mask the peas' sweetness, but rich enough to coat each one with velvety smoothness. Vinegar slaw added the bright, tangy crunch that balanced the rich salmon and creamy peas. Farm wives shredded cabbage from the garden and dressed it with vinegar and a touch of sugar, creating a crisp contrast to the warm, creamy elements on the plate. The slaw had to be made fresh for each meal. Yesterday's wilted cabbage wouldn't provide the sharp crunch that made the combination work. Friday fish dinners connected farm families to religious traditions, even when fresh fish wasn't available. The Catholic practice of eating fish on Fridays meant families needed affordable options that could feed everyone without requiring trips to distant fish markets. Salmon patties democratized the Friday fish tradition, making it accessible to families far from oceans or rivers. The Friday night ritual became something children looked forward to. The sizzle of patties in the skillet, the smell of creamed peas bubbling on the stove, the sharp tang of fresh slaw cutting through rich flavors. These sensory memories would follow them long after they left the farm. Salmon patties proved that canned fish could be transformed into something that felt special and deliberate. The combination of textures, crispy patties, creamy peas, crunchy slaw, made this meal memorable enough to become a weekly tradition. Company night excellence. When special company came to dinner, farm wives brought out their finest ingredients and best techniques. The good china came down from the high shelf, and the best cuts of meat came up from the cellar. This wasn't the time for everyday meals or shortcuts. Chuck roast with pressure-canned green beans represented the pinnacle of farm family hospitality. That tender roast had been selected carefully from the best part of the beef, while the green beans came from jars that had been processed at the peak of summer freshness. Company meals required days of preparation. The roast had to be chosen weeks ahead when the beef was butchered, then aged properly in the cold cellar. The green beans had been selected at their peak of tenderness, processed in small batches to ensure perfect texture and color. Every element on the company plate represented months of planning and the best the farm could produce. The roast itself demanded perfect timing, slow-cooked until fork-tender but not falling apart, seasoned with herbs from the kitchen garden, and presented whole before carving at the table. This wasn't pot roast chopped up and served family style. This was restaurant presentation that showed guests they were worth the extra effort. Pressure-canned green beans retained more color and texture than other preservation methods. Those bright green beans looked like they had just been picked from the garden, not stored in jars for months. The pressure canning process kept them firm and flavorful in ways that water bath canning couldn't achieve. Farm wives took pride in green beans that looked fresh in February, proof of their skill in preservation. The onions cooked with the beans added sweetness that complemented the rich, tender roast. Those caramelized onions had absorbed the beef drippings while adding their own mellow flavor to every forkful of vegetables. The timing had to be perfect. Onions added too early would disappear into mush, too late would remain sharp and raw. Company presentations extended beyond the food itself. The table was set with the wedding china and good silverware, cloth napkins replaced everyday paper, and candles provided warm light that made everyone look their best. The dining room table, reserved for special occasions, replaced the everyday kitchen table where the family usually gathered. Company night dinners required advanced planning and the willingness to use the best preserved foods. This meal demonstrated that farm families could create restaurant-quality food from their own resources. Company night excellence proved that hospitality was measured not in expense, but in care and attention to quality. These 30 forgotten dinners represent more than just meals. They're a masterclass in resourcefulness that built America. Every dish tells the story of families who understood that creativity and skill mattered more than expensive ingredients. Farm wives transformed tough cuts into tender feasts, stretched scarce meat with garden vegetables, and created comfort from whatever the land provided. They knew that feeding people well meant more than just filling stomachs. It meant creating memories and traditions that held communities together. Share your memories of these forgotten feasts in the comments below. Help keep these incredible traditions alive for the next generation.